Good day. We are coming to the last lecture session of Virtual ACTA 2021. After this, there will be a panel discussion. This session is on advanced procedures and is moderated by Dr. Thomas Koshi. Over to Dr. Thomas.
Thank you, Sandeep, for giving me the opportunity. So this is the 9th session, and this is the last session of lectures. And this session we have 4 chairpersons and 3 speakers. The chairpersons are Dr. Mahesh Prabhu from Freeman Hospital, Newcastle, UK. Rajiv Lokan Tiwari from Fortis Escort Hospital, Jaipur. Dr. Suresh Rao from MGM Healthcare, Chennai. And the 4th person is yet to join. He is Dr. Pastor Luna Ortiz from American British Caude Hospital, Brazil. And we have 3 speakers who are going to talk on TAVI and ECMO. May I request, please note delegates, you can put up the your questions in the chat box. We will take the questions at the end of the session. The lectures will be continuous. And may I ask Dr. Mahesh Prabhu to introduce the first speaker.
Thank you very much, Koshi. The first speaker is Dr. Swarup Margale from Australia. He's going to be talking on TAVI anesthesia do's and don'ts. I would like to invite now Dr. Rajiv Tiwari to introduce the next speaker. Thank you.
Dr. Tiwari, your mic is off.
Well, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Hema Nair. She is Senior Consultant in Cardiac Anesthesia, Narayana Institute of Cardiac Sciences, Bangalore. She will be talking on role of the ECMO in CTPH and undergoing PTE, pulmonary thromboendectomy. Now it's over to Dr. Suresh Rao.
Yeah, it's a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Murali Krishna, who is working as a senior consultant cardiac anesthesiologist at MGM Healthcare. He'll be speaking on a very interesting topic, veno-venous ECMO, because veno-venous ECMO has done in a large numbers because of the COVID-19 pandemic affecting the lungs. Over to the speaker.
Now I ask Dr. Swarup to start his lecture.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is Swarup from Brisbane, Australia. I work at Prince Charles Hospital, Brisbane. For this lecture, I don't have any conflict of interest. To outset, I'd like to thank all IACTOCON 2021 whole team, and special thanks to Rajesh and Sandeep for invitation and all help. And my sincere thanks to Dr. Kalpun, who is my interventional cardiologist, and Kathy Lowe, who is the echocardiologist, for their input and slides. And last but not least, all of you for attending this meeting. To just give a glimpse, this is my center number. Up till now, we are just crossing 1,000 number, of which total about transfemoral 794, transaxillary 75, transapical 54, and transaortic 104 procedures. So key objective of this lecture, when I took this topic as TAVI's do's and don'ts, I thought I'll give more of insight into the clinical anesthesia and decision during the TAVI. It's basically meant for initial and ongoing learning curve for all TAVI, or if you want to say TAVR program. AIM is basically for all clinical and practical approaches. And obviously, as I go through the slides, you are being a learned and educated delegates, you're going to find out what's do's and don'ts about all related to the TAVI program. So coming back to today's topic, which is more of a related to the severe aortic stenosis, the hospital mortality after AVR in octogenarians varies between 5 to 7%. In one of the literature, it's been documented around 17%. In some series, 30 to 40% of the patients are considered too high risk for surgery and remain untreated. Obviously, the medical management carries a poor prognosis. And obviously, the effects of percutaneous balloon aortic valvuloplasty are modest and very short-lived. So going back, just to give a background where we are going in terms of all interventional cardiology and particularly TAVI and mitral clips. This is one of the leading cardiologists from Australia, Dr. David Roy. He presented on Channel 10, where likely open heart surgery is going to be obsolete. On translation of this, you can see that New York Times also emphasizes that tens of thousands of heart patients may not need open heart surgery. And on Surplus, you can see that been extended this TAVI program to the all low-risk trials in the current era in cardiology. On top of this, FDA has expanded indication for several transcatheter heart valves to patients at low risk for death or major complication associated with open heart surgery. Just to give an idea what's happening in last whole decade or last 10 years, you can see on the top left screen where the transcatheter aortic valve implantation started with the patients who doesn't or can't undergo a surgery. Starting from that to the high-risk patients in 2011, to the intermediate patients in 2016, and now we are talking about the patients who are in the low risk. So then this slide, you can see the various sort of variables, including the average age of the patients, number of patients, and average STS scores we are dealing with, and average 2 months death rate, which is around 30 to 50% in inoperable patients, and to intermediate risk group, which is around 6%. Just before going on to the anesthetic perspective, I'd like to give a bit current status of TAVI and challenges, so you know what is being served for us in the future as the program advances. If you see the comparison in 2019, currently we are talking most of the centers who are already doing this program, they are talking about a TAVI or TAVR indications in low risk, and the most of the trials are related to the low risk patients. So these are currently some of the challenges. One of them is basically TAVI in TAVIs. That means the patient already had a TAVI in the past, and now we're having an ongoing sort of a symptomatic severe aortic stenosis or in-prosthesis stenosis. On the left screen, you can see which is a portico, which is 8-year-old having a core wall. In the middle screen, you have a S3, which is a 10-year-old and putting an XT. And then in the last one, which is on the right side of the screen, you can see the S3, which is a Basilica procedure. I'll talk about that in the next slide. So what's the Basilica procedure, where actually the prosthesis is likely to occlude the origin of the coronary arteries? So on the left IR screen, you may not actually make sense, a lot of sense, but when you go to the other side of the screen, you can show where actually what we are doing. So where in the native aortic wall, the catheter is passed and then coronary cusp has been split open to maintain the coronary flow. So the new prosthesis coming is less likely to occlude or maintain the coronary flow. So the problem we created is basically of TAVI failure. So patient had a TAVI and now going to have one more TAVI on top of the previous TAVI. So obviously we have a limited experience. They are potentially not feasible or going to be very difficult. They have potential for thrombogenicity in terms of amount of metal and tissue material. And it's currently the intense research interest. Obviously, a sternotomy or surgical aortic wall replacement in previous TAVI got limited and traditionally feared to be a difficult operation, particularly in terms of root replacement, not possible, or peel-off TAVI is going to be a nightmare. and it's also be of interest in current era. So what about the low risk TAVIs, particularly young patients? These are traditional risk scores neglect the importance of life expectancy, which is what we are dealing with in terms of high risk TAVIs. There are significant challenges in patients with longer life expectancy in terms of durability of transcatheter heart walls, future coronary access, feasibility of future treatments, that is TAVI in TAVI, and going away from the surgical wall replacement. So this is one of the surgical experience they've done in terms of surgical explant, which is a 15 cases experience where the indications were more related to the structural heart degeneration, structural paravalvular leak, and TAVI-related complications, endocarditis, and bridge to the definitive surgery. What are some of the challenges in the TE? So you can see there are various sort of transcatheter walls are available in the market. So we have to know the design, the logistics, and ergonomics in and out to be a better toe cardiologist or better toe anesthetist. So this is one of the image where showing the posterior calcification, where you have to be very well aware, which can be possibly the reason for multiple paravalvular leaks or jets. So this is another diagram which is actually emphasizes the need for thorough toe examination and posterior calcification in the diagram denoted by the arrow. So another problem is the perivalvular aortic regurgitation, which need careful interrogations in terms of small vena contracta and a clock phase percentage of clock circumferences. So normally we denote in terms of the percentage of circumference involved, like 10%, 10 to 20%, and more than 20%. So essentially what you need to do is to find out on phase, or if possible, if you have a machine capability of X-plane, then you can use this capacity to have more delineate the amount of aortic regurgitation. So that's another problem in terms of coronary access, where the fundamentally easy for a shorter THV walls, particularly superior to RCA engagement over the self-expanders. So obviously this is one of the patients where there is a wall is low seated or low coronary, and the coronary access is easy. So this is a cartoon film which is showing the various implantation in terms of intra-annular balloon expandable sapien on the left side of the screen compared to the supra-annular self-expanding core walls. So in terms of coronary access, as it expands, patients with a coronary artery disease, coronary access should become an important consideration for this type of choice. So obviously in terms of low-risk TAVI, it's a perfect implant is needed because we can't have anything less than no parallel leak, no pacemakers, no CVA, no vascular NGs, and planning an operator experience in terms of future coronary access and future prospect of TAVI in TAVI. So this is so-called as individualized medicine in terms of artificial intelligence and modeling the new anatomy in optimizing the device choice and optimizing the device sizing as well as the placement. So coming back to the anesthetics, so as we all anesthetist, this is all about geriatric anesthesia considerations, which are related to mainly physiological changes of aging, cardiovascular system, respiratory changes, poor nutritional status, and cognitive impairment. So interventional cardiology perspective, as we all know, these have pre-morbid with the coronary calcification, ischemic heart disease, CABGs, aortic calcifications, arteriovenous plaques, aortic stenosis, and associated valvular pathologies like mitral, pulmonary, and hypertension. So in terms of risk assessment, as we know, there are various pre-existed validated scores available like Euroscore, ST-score, ASS-score, score, but these are mainly focuses on the medical diagnosis and medical comorbidities, which are main variable and little account given to the biological status of the patients. So this is what we are going to deal is basically geriatric syndrome of frailty, which is an emerging concept and poorly incorporated, and which needs integrated approach with the frailty and disability scores in addition to the pre-existing risk scores gives a better idea of risk profile and perioperative complications. So these are the various indices available. And in addition, you need to find out the activities of daily living, which are become the core element for disabilities indices. So it's essentially you need all these three evaluation of frailty, comorbidities, and disability indices. In a nutshell, the preoperative assessment, not about just a procedure or discharge from the ICU or ward, but returning the patient to fully functional post-operative status, and need comprehensive multidisciplinary and proactive pre-op assessment, which need more resources than conventional assessment. So this is all usual our complete history and physical examination, which includes all our thorough systemic examination, cognitive ability, capacity, depression, alcohol, substance abuse, cardiac evaluation, functional evaluation, frailty evaluation, nutritional status, medication history, polypharmacy, and obviously treatment goals. So this is in my center, most of these patients are seen by the geriatric medicine physicians. You can see how thoroughly she has written down in terms of notes and all in and outs of comorbidities, medication history, social history, geriatric reviews, and obviously impression and what's been planned for these patients. So very thorough. So these are basically logistic regression, which talks about the predictors of delirium, which are age, Mini-Mental scale examination, neurological disease, and mixed unit saturation, in addition to the hemoglobin, BNPs. So interventional approach. So you need to find out which approach we're doing: transfemoral, transaxillary, transaortic, transapical. So obviously anesthesia, intraoperative, I don't think it's a rocket science, but appropriate selection of elderly patients mean management does not differ from any other standard younger patients. So essentially a drip, arc line, endotracheal tube, toe, and cardiovascular line, CVC line, that's your central line. So local versus GA, normally this is what I ask. Can patient lie flat for 1 hour with a local sedation technique? Is it possible? Does the patient need toe or TE? Is your procedure fast enough to finish the procedure, anesthesia, and actual procedure within 90 minutes? Other points to consider: learning curve, team experience, fast track TAVIs, choosing patient wisely. Think about the airway intervention, peri-ARREST situations, crisis, complication management, hostile aortic route, including coronary obstructions, plan for anticipated PCIs, placement of carotid protection devices, Basilica procedures, and obviously efficient use of ultrasound. Learning curve, everybody is learning as you learn, and including all teams' possibilities. So do a thorough preoperative assessment, as I already said. Do general anesthetic for at least for first almost 50-100 cases. No shortcuts, no experiments. Become proactive in planned procedures and team briefing a day prior. No fallback plan if happen. Know all ergonomics, layout of the cath lab, and hybrid. Keep close group 1 to 2 anesthetists in the beginning for the first 50 cases, and then translate the knowledge and expertise to the other extended group as the volume and expertise increases. So these are my 2 colleagues in the pictures who actually have become a core member for our TAVI program. So success lies in volume, simplicity, no experiments, no adventure for first few cases. So there are only 2 rules. Rule number 1, do thorough preoperative assessment in addition to attending the all multidisciplinary meetings. And rule number 2, do not forget rule number 1. Thank you. So in this picture, I got my all teammates who helped me for my TAVIs in public and private hospital. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everybody. I would like to thank the organizers of IACTA for inviting me for this talk. I'm going to talk about the use of ECMO in patients with CTEPH undergoing PTE surgery. A small overview about the disease. Pulmonary thromboendarterectomy, or PTE, is the definitive therapy for chronic thromboembolic pulmonary hypertension, or CTEPH. Following a pulmonary embolism, 2 to 4% of patients progress to CTEPH. What happens is that the embolus within the pulmonary artery lumen organizes fibrosis, thus the vessel wall becomes thickened and non-compliant. This results in the PVR going high, and then you have a suprasystemic PA pressure. Long-standing high PA pressures mean that the RV has to pump against an increased afterload, and it slowly starts becoming dysfunctional and even failing. A lot of these patients also have hypoxia, which is multifactorial. One reason is the VQ mismatch. The other reasons for suboptimal lung function are the presence of bronchopulmonary collaterals and reperfusion edema. Reperfusion edema follows pulmonary endarterectomy because the intima is denuded and the pulmonary arterial wall becomes thinned out. Bronchopulmonary collaterals is a way of getting around the fact that the normal path for the blood to go into the pulmonary arteries is now obstructed. Therefore, the intercostals and the bronchial artery hypertrophy and try to provide blood to the lung parenchyma. Quite apart from all the existing disease, the surgery itself is very extensive, involving the use of cardiopulmonary bypass and hypothermic circulatory arrest. And some of these patients are likely to have a stormy post-op period, and that is where the role of ECMO comes in to bail them out. Looking at our ECMO experience for our patients undergoing PT, over an 8-year period, we looked at 371 patients who had underwent PTE, and in that, 18% of them needed ECMO for a bailout. The survival in the patients who had ECMO was 38%. It seems like a very small amount, small survival rate, but you have to consider that without ECMO, almost 100% of them would have probably died. Mortality in the non-ECMO patients is much more acceptable at 6%. The age range was very wide in our group of patients, from 21 years to 73 years, and we had more male patients than female. The patients with CTEPH generally have a very prothrombotic tendency because of an existing systemic disease like antiphospholipid antibody syndrome. And in our cohort, we had 21 patients who were APLA positive. 39% of our patients had pre-existing pulmonary embolus, and 48% of them reported DVT. You have to understand that more than half of them did not report having a deep vein thrombosis, even though we know that clots from the distal deep veins are the ones which embolize and then eventually end up in the patients having CTEPH. Because of this prothrombotic tendencies, these patients are treated with anticoagulants preoperatively. Only 4 of our patients were not on anticoagulants. That is because they were diagnosed in hospital, and once they were diagnosed, they were started on unfractionated heparin till they could be operated upon. This is a picture of the internal jugular vein. It's an ultrasound image of the neck, and this is the vessel wall, and it is filled with a thrombus, so much so that only within it is a clear area of fluid blood within which the CVP line is sited. Just to show you an example of the prothrombotic tendency. The table on the left is gives us the indications and the outcomes of the ECMO in our series. 9 patients had biventricular dysfunction, of which 22% survived. 9 patients had exclusive RV dysfunction, of which more than half of them survived. The largest number by far are the patients who needed ECMO from hypoxia, 30 patients. 2 patients had persistent pulmonary hypertension and needed ECMO. In 7 patients, ECMO was used as a rescue maneuver following cardiac arrest. In 2 patients, we needed ECMO because the lungs could not do their job because of being flooded with blood because of pulmonary hemorrhage. This is a surgical specimen following an endarterectomy. These are the casings, almost like a mold of the pulmonary artery, with small lobar and lobular arteries visible here. RV dysfunction is the other common indication for ECMO, and 65% of our patients had documented severe RV dysfunction. They presented sometimes with hepatomegaly, raised JVP, and even ascites and bilateral pedal edema. These patients are very grossly fluid overloaded, and the way we manage them preoperatively is with hemofiltration. We hemofiltered patients who had a CVP of more than 20 millimeters of mercury. In this, we used the guidelines for the management of heart transplantation recipients who undergo hemofiltration pre-transplant if the CVP is high. The aggressive hemofiltration continued during CPB, and also if they went on to ECMO afterwards, the hemofiltration continued then also. To take care of RV dysfunction, it is better to extubate them and have them spontaneously breathing as early as possible. We have actually tried to do that even while the patients were on ECMO. The other indication for which the patients need ECMO is hypoxia. It could be because of reperfusion edema, which is generally seen in 10% of patients following PT surgery. Reperfusion edema is more in the areas of reperfused lung in patients with aortopulmonary collaterals. And sometimes we do not know why it happens. It could be due to just generalized blood staining of the bronchial tree or an underlying pneumonia or sepsis. In some patients, because of massive blood transfusion also, you see hypoxia, for which we need ECMO support. When deciding on an ECMO support for hypoxia, we use the Murray score of ARDS as a guideline, because here we use the ratio of the FiO2 to the PaO2, the compliance of the lung, radiological picture, as well as the level of PEEP that is required to maintain the oxygenation. For hypoxia, initially VV ECMO is enough, but if it is compounding the ventricular dysfunction, then we may also have to move on to VA ECMO. ECMO was initially used in our center following pulmonary hemorrhage, till we devised a new technique for diagnosing and treating the pulmonary hemorrhage while the patient was in circulatory arrest. It's described in this paper, which is published in 2015. In this case, the pulmonary hemorrhage was because of a rent in the pulmonary artery, which was caused during surgery. And the solution for that was to plug the rent using a Surgicel wick. In one of our patients, after we devised this technique, we were able to wean off the ECMO within 3 hours in the operating theater itself. And we were able to reverse the heparin, terminate the ECMO, and the patient made an uneventful recovery following that. ECMO is sometimes needed intraoperatively, transitioning directly from the CPB. This happened in 24 of the patients in our series. This is because of inability to wean off the CPB. The bicaval venous cannula is converted to a single RA cannula, and the aortic cannula remains as such. This is needed in patients who have severe ventricular dysfunction, refractory hypoxia, which again further causes worsening of the cardiac function, or in patients with persistent PAH. In 32 of our patients, we were able to wean off CPB, but still needed ECMO support in the first few days after surgery. A couple of our patients also needed ECMO support in the first week following surgery. 3 of our patients were initially started on VV ECMO, but then later had to be converted to VA ECMO. 2 of our patients had 2 runs of ECMO, and 1 of these patients actually survived. 5 needed only VV ECMO for hypoxia. This is a technique that we follow, which is closed chest central ECMO. In this, what we do is the ECMO cannula are tunneled outside the patient's body in the epigastric region. This, what you see here, is a chest tube. These are the 2 ECMO cannula. This enables us to close the sternotomy wound and wire the sternum. This maintains the lung dynamics, which enables us to extubate the patient so that they can breathe spontaneously. It's described here in this article published in 2017. The advantage of being able to extubate the patients on ECMO. You can see here, this patient is mobilized and is sitting in a chair. These are the tubings which is taking the blood to the ECMO. So he's actually on ECMO, but we are able to mobilize him. Both central and peripheral ECMO patients can be mobilized. It is better for chest physiotherapy. Therefore, it helps with better lung dynamics and the RV function. The patient themselves feel so much more better motivated, and their mood is also better. They don't need a lot of sedation and paralysis to keep them quiet and intubated. Termination of the ECMO in patients who have had a peripheral ECMO can actually be even done without needing general anesthesia. We have done that on occasions with just a femoral nerve block if the cannulas are sited in the groin. Of course, for central ECMO termination, we will need to take them to theater. The complications that we have faced in our series are listed here. We had sepsis in 21% of the patient, 21% of patients, which is often seen in patients on ECMO because of the amount of blood products, open chest, bleeding. So we also had our share of sepsis. Reperfusion edema was seen in 16% of the patients, bleeding in 35%, and by far the largest complication was renal dysfunction in 42% of the patients, 25% of whom required renal replacement therapy. To conclude, overall salvage rates for ECMO in our series was 38%. We do elective PT cases only with an ECMO machine on standby. ECMO has helped improve outcomes in our patients where previously survival would have been difficult. This is particularly relevant in centers without access to indwelling RV support devices like the Impeller. And also if you do not have approved medical therapies for persistent pulmonary hypertension like riociguat. That's the end of our talk. Thank you very much. This slide is just to show you how uphill a task is running the ECMO in a PT patient. But once you get to the top, the view is very good. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Murali Krishna from MGM Healthcare in Chennai. For the next 12 minutes, I'll briefly talk about ECMO for COVID-19, when to look, what are the issues, and what's our experience in these cases. To start with, the ECMO for COVID-19 should be looked only as a last resort. That is, when we're not able to maintain the gas exchange by all means. When we use the word all means, we should have prone these patients, and that should not have yielded the result what we wanted to maintain an adequate gas exchange. In the same way, we should have definitely put the patient through the ARDS ventilation protocols. In spite of all these, if you're not able to maintain adequate gas exchange, that's when we need to put these patients on ECMO or consider ECMO for them. There have been guidelines that have been set by the ELSO in guiding us in what kind of patients we should choose or when should we consider this. But having said that, we should always tune it to according to our institutional practices. So if we look at that guideline suggested by the ELSO, it shows that whenever you have a PF ratio of less than 60 for at least 6 hours or more than that, or if the PF ratio is less than 50 for a period of 3 hours or more than that, that's when you should think of instituting ECMO in these patients. Apart from this, if you have a hypercapnia where the PCO2 climbs more than 80 and is associated with a pH of less than 7.2, very important. If this is compensated, then we do not look for it. If the PCO2 is associated with a pH of less than 7.2, that is when we have to think of, and this persists for more than 6 hours, that's when we have to think of doing ECMO in these cases. So if you have any case of this kind, you just have to review whether they have undergone all the medical management or proning and ventilation protocols. If that's fine, then look at whether there's a case of an active contraindication or anything is there for the ECMO. If that is not the case, that's where we go ahead and institute the ECMO or plan about the ECMO in these cases. So before we go into the slides, I just want to present the data from the ELSO registry. A few things here to emphasize. A data of close to 2,500 patients have been compiled. These are all the veno-venous ECMO patients who required ECMO for the sake of COVID damaged lung. One, as we see, a good number of them, the hospital stay or the duration of support is very long, as we see in the x-axis. So these patients, we need to be prepared for supporting them for a very long time. As we see the support duration often extending up to 3 months in these cases. Second, the outcomes because of the nature of the disease may not be as encouraging as in the other subsets. Close to 45% of them have passed away in the hospital, and the discharge is only say roughly 10% of them got discharged from the hospital. The remaining patients, the remaining 30 or 40% of them, according to the registry, have gone to a long-term care, whether further on the ventilator or partially weaned off. They require the further care in the hospital or long-term hospice care kind of supports. So this is what the data from the ELSO shows. Briefly, we need to be prepared for supporting these patients for a very long term. So our practice, when it comes to choosing a patient, we look at all the following criteria. What is the age of the patient? By far, we deny ECMO support, or we won't go for it aggressively for anyone more than 65 years of age. Only one case we have done more than that 71 years age group. Other than that, everyone it's less than 65. Even in the age of 60 to 65, we approach with caution whether it's going to really benefit him, looking at the patient from all the point of view. But less than 60, we do consider almost all the patients for whether they are fit for ECMO or not. So second factor is the degree of lung involvement. Obviously, by the time they come to us, they'll be having a severe disease with almost full CORAD score. Then how about the other organs? Whether this patient is having an end organ damage secondary to critical status, or there's a sepsis that's ongoing, or the good amount of them by the time we get a call would be having a very bad sepsis, having a multi-organ dysfunction. So multi-organ dysfunction per se is not a contraindication, but it's something we need to look at a great caution. If the liver and renal parameters are not badly deranged, and if we suppose that these are all secondary to the hypoxia, then probably supporting them with this may help them in recovery. And most of the cases, what we got were the late referrals. When I say the word late referrals, means we have crossed the 3 weeks or 4 weeks of the disease phase, and who are going to go for the chronic disease where the chronic changes are set in, or where the possibility of the recovery of the lung were significantly less. But for the patients which come in the acute phase, that is around 2 weeks to 3 weeks of the active disease, so provided we support on ECMO, the chance of them turning around will be quite good. And any patient, as we have seen in the previous slide, the duration of support often needs to be extended for a few months. So any patient who is not from long-term care from any point of view, say the psychological aspects or the medical aspects, will not be considered for the ECMO. So keeping all this in backdrop, we choose our patient. And it is quite a common scenario that for the calls, what we got almost 100%, I mean, all of them were at 100% oxygen with a very bad desaturation by the time we got a call. And all the patients were already had an episodes of sepsis with multiple MDR bugs, with multiple antibiotics going on. And an element of organ dysfunction also was there. So in a nutshell, by the time we get a call about putting on ECMO, these are the patients who are very sick and obviously are not going to meet unless we put them on ECMO. Contraindications for not doing, as I said, is more than 65, we usually don't consider, or when there is a bad MODS where your creatinine is more than 2 or bilirubin more than 5, we don't consider, or any other neurological issues or patient is not awake, that's where we don't consider. So all the patients undergo insertion under echo and ultrasound guidance. We select the vessels and see the size and choose a cannula of that. The standard and the most common format that's used is use the femoral cannula for drainage, followed by an internal jugular vein for the return. Having said that, all different configurations have been used in our experience. We have tried both femorals, we have tried only jugulars. So especially in cases where there is a deep venous thrombosis or thrombosis of both the femoral arteries or one femoral arteries, we go for a dual stage cannula position through the internal jugular vein into the IVC. So the cannula final position will be confirmed by using both the transthoracic and transesophageal echo. So all cases, whatever done in our institute, were done under percutaneous cannulation. And there are variations, like 3 patients required a veno-arterial ECMO. 1 patient was near cardiac arrest by the time he reached our hospital, so we had to put on veno-arterial ECMO. Then another one had an arrhythmias while we were doing the VV ECMO, so that had to be converted to veno-arterial ECMO. 3rd patient had a cardiac arrest while supporting with an intubated and was managed with a ventilator, so that had to be converted to a veno-arterial ECMO. So all the 3 cases were after 48 hours were converted to a VAV ECMO, and eventually after another 24 hours the arterial component has been totally weaned off and were managed only as a VV ECMO after 4 days of initiation of ECMO support. So most of our cases we have done in our place at the same time. The number 15, it's more than that. It is close to 25 cases. We have shifted from other cities to our place for continuing the ECMO support, and patients have come from across all the cities in India. So the challenges for insertion, one is doing it in the COVID ICU setups where we have to wear the full PPEs that totally blunts your reflexes. Apart from that, going to multiple locations and doing it in unfamiliar places, insertion of the ECMO. And a good amount of these patients will be quite unstable because of the poor gas exchange by the time we insert the ECMO. And 4th challenge may be patients who are having thrombosis of the veins, so that you don't have good cannulation sites or optimum cannulation sites. So maintenance, all of them, the anticoagulation will be titrated based upon the APTT targets, and heparin was the commonly used drug. But in patients who developed thrombocytopenia, we shifted from heparin to bivalirudin, and bivalirudin has, in our experience, has done the job well. And all of them, we keep them awake with a minimal sedation, plan to keep them awake, keep them on oral feeds and possibly mobilize them. And coming to the ventilation of these patients on ECMO, go for a lung ultra-protective ventilation where you ventilate them with less than 4 ml per kg tidal volume. Rather, the lungs were so bad in few of them that it's barely able to deliver like 40-50 ml with a compliance of 5 or less than 5. So where the lung has been extensively consolidated both sides by this patient. And both the ventilation and further management was guided by the ventilator graphics and the CT scan, which was repeated at an interval of 10 days to 2 weeks. Prone positioning was done wherever we felt based upon the CT findings that may help the patients. And we can definitely prone the patients on ECMO, provided we just take care of the cannulas. There's no kink or there's no accidental dislodgement. And patients were mobilized, and we change a cannulation strategy wherever possible from the femorojugular to jugular dual stage cannula so that they can be easily mobilized. This is a video of a patient who was on ECMO and for COVID-19. We prone him. He was an femoral ECMO. This is the video of a patient who is made to sit in the chair with a dual stage cannula through the IJV into the RA-IVC. So what issues we had in maintaining these patients for long term, to put in briefly? One, the bleeding episodes. A good amount of our patients had bleeding episodes. The most common site was the gastrointestinal tract, whether it is the upper gastrointestinal tract, which is more frequent, or a lower gastrointestinal tract. And the second common site of bleeding was the tracheostomy, and all the patients underwent tracheostomy, all of them. So in 2 cases, it was quite a major bleed requiring taking out tube and controlling by a surgical thing. All other cases, the other 3 cases, the bleeding got controlled by just some compression or by taking a single stitch. Pulmonary hemorrhage was there in 4 cases, and that was quite significant hemorrhage. Intracranial bleed happened in 3 patients, and once the intracranial bleed happened, the prognosis was not good in all 3 of them. Coming to the management, once they had a bleeding, we go for a coagulation profile-based management, correcting of all parameters aggressively. Heparin-free ECMO was run on all the patients once there was an episode of bleeding, and we were able to run heparin-free ECMO for weeks once the patient had bleeding episodes. Endoscopic intervention was done by the gastroenterology team as and when required. And by default, all the patients got a PPA or stool softener, because what we noticed was once the patients, by the time the patients come to us, they would have been already 2 to 3 weeks in the ICU, and often neglected component was whether the patient passed stool or not. This led to an rectal ulcers and anal tests. So stool softeners, rather 3 of them, were the standard practice to be put once we put the patient on ECMO. So ECMO circuit related and oxygenator change was done in all the patients roughly around 3 to 4 weeks intervals. Delta P and post-membrane gas were the ones which were guiding us given to change the circuit. And the circuit change is usually a drill where close to more than 10 people act with 4 different teams. One to change the circuit on the inflow cannula, one to change it the return cannula, one to handle the ECMO machine, and one to handle one team to handle the vitals. In spite of all this, and in spite of able to do it off in a period of as short as 10 seconds, we do see that most of them go into episodes of bradycardia, not able to tolerate even that short period of the ECMO support. So other issue we faced was a critical illness neuromyopathy. Most of the patients who came to us were sedated and paralyzed and ventilated for a prolonged period of time, leading to the secondary complication of critical illness neuromyopathy. Once we get them, we usually keep on very minimal sedation and try to keep them fully awake. Aggressive physiotherapy and rehabilitation were the mainstays of managing this. In spite of all this, even in the patients who did very well, it took weeks to months for this critical illness neuromyopathy to come back to a normal muscle power. Infection was the main spoil sport in all these things. The main reason for the was the damaged lung, which was harboring the bugs continuously, and patients having septic attacks arising out of the lungs. And most of the patient had XDR bugs by the time we got a call to this one. We adopted strategies within a strict infection control measures and having a separate room for all the patients, keeping an ID and infectious disease consultant microbiologist in the loop or in the picture. And we used cytokine filter in close to 10 cases wherever we had a septic attack that was not amenable to conventional management of antibiotics and vasopressors. So these are the photos of the lungs that were explanted just to show the degree of involvement or the extensive damage that happens because of COVID-19. This leads to extensive cavities in the lung, which forms as an active substrate for infection. And when these lungs were dissected out after explantation during the transplant time, a lot of them had full of pus in them. Down shows a photo of the patient having a continuous pus that's coming from the chest tube. That's empyema or a ruptured lung abscess. So all these patients, as we discussed right from the beginning, are for long-term support. So these all factors are quite important. We have to take care of the nutrition, cachexia. Unless we really look and aggressively go after it right from the beginning, patients will become cachexic. So the calories and the proteins have been aggressively taken care. Same way, oral feeds have been promoted for all the patients as and when possible, even though the caloric meat was required by the rice to feeds. Physiotherapy and mobilization have been done aggressively. The position changes and taking care of cannulation sites, especially when we are supporting them for a long time. Once beyond 3 to 4 weeks, we may see a wound gaping in some of the cannulation sites. That's when we go and change to an alternate site. Keeping them negative fluid balance overall and taking care of psychological aspects of these patients is also quite important. So the progress of disease was monitored by both the clinical, radiological signs and the blood gas parameters. Usually CT was done in a period of an average of 10 days. And consider weaning once we see any clinical improvement in this patient. And if we don't have any improvement after around 3 weeks of ECMO support, that's when we put them in the transplant pathway. So a total close to 51 ECMOs have been done. A good number of them have been male patients. There have been all age groups. As I said, only one was 71. Rest all have been less than 65 years, and most of them are less than 60 years. The duration of support is extending up to 95 days and still going on. The patient is still on ECMO support. A few of them recovered. 6 out of 7 of them recovered, and some of them we transplanted. A few of them are still waiting. A good amount of them, especially the ones who presented late with an active ongoing infection or an element of multi-organ dysfunction, could not survive. To conclude, this is the last resort, the VV ECMO in a patient who is having a COVID-19. As we have seen, COVID-19, these patients take time, both for the recovery of the lungs, or if you're looking at a transplant pathway for the availability of the lungs. So VV ECMO has to be planned as a long-term support, and we are supporting any patient this long. Obviously, the parameters like infection control or handling of septic attacks, nutrition management, and physiotherapy becomes very, very important. If we finally put down indications, if you're looking at it as a bridge to recovery, this is helpful in the early stage of disease, that is in the first 2 to 3 weeks when they have severe hypoxia and you're not able to manage with the conventional ventilation measures. And even if they're intubated, if they have a shorter duration of mechanical ventilation, that is where this has been shown to have better outcomes. If you're looking at it as a bridge to transplant, like a patient, even if it is late in the disease, you want to put them on ECMO, then support it till you get an organ. This is definitely, yes, it works for it. We just have to support them till we get an appropriate organ. Thank you.
Thank you, all speakers. All the speakers gave a focused, sweet presentation. May I ask Suresh Rao to give a focused review of the 3 lectures?
I think we had very useful sessions on advanced care. First, Dr. Swaroop talked about the management of aortic stenosis and the TAVI. As the life expectancy has increased, we see more and more patients with calcific aortic stenosis, and they are elderly. Dr. Swaroop is discussed about the various types of TAVI approaches, risk factors, complications, and it is challenging for the cardiac anesthesiologist to manage the anesthesia because of the geriatric age, frailty, and the cardiac status. So, as cardiac anesthesiology, we can play a major role in the overall outcome of this complex procedure. Then Dr. Hema talked about the utility of ECMO in pulmonary thromboembolectomy. We have to remember that they are prothrombotic, so we need to be careful about the anticoagulation. They can also develop pulmonary dysfunction after the procedure, so ECMO is a useful technique. They can also develop RV dysfunction, and apart from the hemofiltration, VA ECMO may be useful. Apart from that, they can also have hemodynamic instability, wherein we know arterial ECMO will be useful thing. And finally, we had a talk on VV ECMO by Dr. Murli. Nowadays, with COVID-19 pandemic, we do see a very complex situation where the lungs are totally destroyed. So we don't know what to do. So VV ECMO is an important technique. So as a bridge to recovery or as a bridge to transplant. So with veno-venous ECMO, we have seen recovery of the lungs. Sometimes the lung will not recover. They will develop sepsis, hemorrhage, and we may lose them also. At the same time, we have seen some of the patients, VV ECMO, where the lungs are not recovering, but they don't have any other organs involved in the process. So they are the candidates for bilateral lung transplantation. So the important thing whenever you put on ECMO is to keep them awake, if possible, also to mobilize them. So with these remarks, I think the panelists and the speakers will be ready to take up any questions by the delegates. I ask Dr. Koshi to see any questions or see that those are answered.
Sandeep, we have time for a few questions.
One or two questions.
One or two questions. Anyway, thank you, Suresh. You are putting VVIPs on VVECMOs with good result also. So Hema has done that. So so there are some 6-7 questions. So first question is to the first speaker, Swaroop. Is TTE or TOE which is better in TAVI? There is a question from Dr. Sandeep.
I think probably I can go wholly talking about TTE versus TOE. But I think if you are doing as a learning curve, then probably I think the best thing is to start with GA and TOE. There's a lot of evidence of residual aortic regurg and lots of residual calcification and TAVI-related complications. I think then probably the first thing is, if you ask me what you prefer, I think probably for the first few cases, probably I think TOE is probably the better idea. As you grow with your experience, then probably it's better to go with your transthoracic.
Okay, the second question is to Swaroop. For TAVI, cardiologists are moving away from GA. They advise conscious sedation. So you are managing cases with GA or sedation, monitored anesthesia care?
So currently we got a percentage about, I say now 70-30, 70% of the patients undergo GA and 30% to local sedation. But as I said in one of my slides, the first thing you should be actually talking to the patient, what patient prefers. I think it's a very must question what the patient preference is. If the other thing is you go with your comorbid conditions, and if the patient can't lie flat, then you really don't have a choice. And third thing is basically type of prosthesis. That's the most 3 important questions will answer your all questions. I think probably most of the times local sedation, we are used to get with this procedure done in other procedures. For example, aortic valvuloplasty, mitral valvuloplasty. So this is not a painful procedure. So this can be done under local sedation with or without any sort of a block like ilioinguinal, iliohypogastric, and combination of femoral blocks. So it's not a difficult task to do a local sedation technique.
Okay, thank you. So the second question, a third question, I'll ask Dr. Hema. It is directed to Hema. The question reads: during or after embolectomy, if the lungs start pouring out, what is your management protocol? Is Hema there?
I'm sorry, I was muted, sir. In our experience, when we have seen pulmonary hemorrhage happening because of an intimal tear, and it is a dreadful thing to see. It is only when we come off bypass and blood starts pouring out of the endotracheal tube that you realize that something like that has happened. But ever since we have devised this technique where we diagnose the intimal rent, that is, we ventilate the patient with our bag circuit, and we see the bubbling in the pulmonary artery, we figure out that there is a rent there. And this is while the PA is open, while on TCA. And that rent is plugged with a Surgicel Vic, that bleeding is secure. And then we progress with the surgery where PA is closed, reperfused, we come off bypass. So that torrential hemorrhage we have not seen since we have devised this technique of handling pulmonary hemorrhage. But there are instances where you might see a rupture of a bronchial artery after you come off bypass. If you see blood coming out from the endotracheal tube, the important thing is to secure the other lung, the most important thing, because often it is localized to one lobe or lobule or one lung. And the more damage is done because of the spillage of the blood into the healthy lung, and then gas exchange takes a toss. So first thing, isolate the culprit lung. Second thing, see if the remaining lung is able to take the burden of gas exchange and whether you can wean off bypass. If you can wean off bypass, ASAP reverse the heparin with the protamine. You have no time for MUF. in this situation. It's clamp off and shoot in the protamine. So if it is a minor enough rent, that will stop. And then you can just manage the rest of the lung by frequent lavage and clearing out the lung and clear, so that gas exchange can progress. If you can't do that, if gas exchange is not possible, then you have to go back on ECMO and support the lung till it is able to do its job. Because if in this situation, this heart is not going to be able to take any hypoxia. The right ventricle is already very sick, and it will topple over, it will fail. So we will have to support them with ECMO for a few days till the lung recovers.
Okay, so I think I got a few seconds. The question is again to Swarup, which are the patients you prefer not to do TAVI and go for conventional surgery? That is question from Dr. Sandip. Anything?
I think it's very obvious answer.
Oh.
The first and most important thing is we have got a very little evidence in terms of younger patient population. So that is one underlying things. I mean to say in terms of low risk population. So that's very, very important thing. And others are actually relative things in terms of degree of calcifications. Those who need any other procedure in addition to this tackling with the aortic stenosis, like a bypass procedure, mitral valve replacement, or some sort of other degree intervention. So the most important underlying indication is probably a low risk patients. That's the crux where they don't have really more choice. So they will have to go under the surgical area.
So we have to wind up. Organizers have put the red flag. So thanks to all the chairpersons and the presenters, and also the audience for their interaction. Over to the
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to all.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well done, actor. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandeep. Thank you, Ekta. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.